this, just as you did just now, this kind of talk is prefaced by saying this is the theory talk, where lots of other contributions are more applied. I hope we can bridge the gap a little bit. While it's true that I'm not just a philosopher, but in this talk concerned with theoretical questions, I hope we can either, I can already make it applied enough for different perspectives to latch on to what I say, or we can see how what I have to say applies in various areas. Now, the background of this, let's say, reflection, is that in many contexts, especially in law and in business, the question whether a social entity or an entity counts as an agent can be taken to be pretty much settled, right? Because there we talk of legal persons or of corporations or of the firm or of other social entities whose status as agent is established. And for the most part, in such contexts, and that determines, of course, much of the framework for legal and economic scholarship, it's also settled what kind of normative status they have. Although I think there's a good reason for pragmatically zeroing in on what's already acknowledged as, let's say, a corporate agent and its normative status, many social philosophers, political philosophers want to take a step back, and maybe not with the intent of criticizing the status quo, but with the aim of understanding better what's going on in the social world. Ask what makes an agent, a collective agent, and what gives them their or a special normative status if they have any. And so I think this summarizes rather accurately more recent debates in social philosophy and social ontology in particular, which I want to summarize in the first two questions I've put on the handout, which I'm, by the way, willing to share with anyone, and we can sort of exchange ideas about that more if you want. So the first question is, which collectives, if any, count as agents in their own right? This is a formative question for much of recent scholarship. I would like to think that there are many questions involved in this one, although this, as I've phrased it here, is the one that's, let's say, attracted most attention. I think one of the important upshots of this talk will be that we can talk of collectives as agents and their agency, even in contexts and even in cases where they don't have agency in their own right. In their own right is one of the formulations usually applied when you want to say it's irreducible. We'll get to that in a minute. A second question that's informed much debate recently is the question as to what determines the normative status of a collective agent or a collective at all. So since the topic of this conference provides some, let's say, domain, we can limit ourselves to the usual examples. So corporations or firms, they are, well, they're social entities, they're social structures of sort. You can also say that they're in some respect and in some important respects, most of them are social groups. So they have individuals as members, and as such, let's say, are candidates for collective agency in the sense relevant here. So with respect to such social groups, we can ask whether they have agency, whether they are agents, and whether the kind of agency they have is irreducible. And we can ask what kind of normative status they have, whether they have responsibilities, duties, rights, and so on, where I'm particularly interested in the moral sense. Let me talk a bit more, and that's the purpose of this talk, as the title indicates, about agential and normative features of collectives. Start with the agential features. I've labeled this reflection as a reflection of on agential profiles, because we're interested in what combination of features turns an entity into an agent in general, and a collective into an agent more in particular. Now, first, a general, let's say, starting point is that the status of agency is generally tied to a variety of capacities an entity has to, let's say, exhibit in combination, in some combination. Now, if you take, well, I'll give a list. It doesn't have to be comprehensive, and there's a lot more to be said about this. But if you take this kind of list and think of an entity that exhibits all these features, then maybe that's what you want to talk of as full-blown agency. That doesn't mean, however, that an entity that doesn't display these features in, let's say, in the full form or something like that, isn't an agent at all, but maybe its agency is reduced in some way, or we want to say something along those lines. So typical of agents is that they are capable of observing or registering what's going on in their surroundings, that they're able to process information, to form preferences, to deliberate, to make decisions, and to enact decisions. So very abstractly, you can call something an agent if it in some way, and maybe we want to say autonomously, it itself observes its environment, processes information, and acts on its environment. In view of collectives, if we want to fill in how collectives can have these features, the most controversial issue is whether they can have any or even all of those capacities irreducibly. Now, how that could be is, of course, controversial with respect to the different features I've listed, but this, let's say, the most promise attached with non-reductivist account or non-reductionist account is attached to the feature of decision-making, of deliberation and decision-making. So there's a whole body of literature concerned with the idea of judgment aggregation that, well, at least is very often invoked as showing that there is a genuinely collective and irreducible way of decision-making that can be instantiated in collectives. And if they do so, so the argument goes, then their agency is, at least in this sense, irreducible. Whether they're collectives, on the other hand, they can't be observers since they don't have senses. So they can't be observers in the sense you and I are, but they can be observers in different ways if they have, let's say, their members observe for them. And so the same goes for enactment and some of the other features. Affirming such the irreducible having of agential capacities for attitudes, judgment, and decisions leads to specific questions regarding the relationship between the collective and its individual members. So whenever you're going to say a collective has this agential feature irreducibly, you're going to have to say something about how this relates to the capabilities of the, or the capacities of the members. Now, I think, and I've said in many other places, that the case for irreducible collective agency can be made, but it's rarely instantiated. So this is a conceptual point more than an empirical point. None of this literature, I take it, wants to say, look, here's a theory of collective agency, and this shows that all, I don't know, companies, corporations, and other institutions, organizations in general are collective agents. That would be a misconception, a grave misconception of what they are trying to say, of what we are trying to say in this debate. At least what I am trying to say is that it's possible for an organization to have the structures that turn them into agents in their own right. But it will pay out to frame the question of collectives' agency not only in terms of irreducible agency. So if you look at more hierarchical and less ideal collective agents, for many assume that collective agency is only to be had where there are transparent and let's say reflective decision-making structures. So if we step away from that and acknowledge that some organizations are hierarchical, intransparent, and so on, we don't have to say that they don't have agency at all, but typically the agency is at the top, or in, let's say, in the very center of the organization. So doing justice, I want to say, to the varieties of collective agents requires acknowledging that they can function as agents even if capacities aren't ideally collectivized. So the case for collective agency can be made, but it's not present everywhere. Now, speeding up just a little, I want to turn to normative profiles. And here, a lot of what needs to be debated when we talk about collective responsibility, about corporate responsibility, and their irreducibility or their reducibility depends on how we relate the normative status of a collective, let's say, to use a very general term, to its agential status. I want to say, I claim and I argue elsewhere that an entity's normative status is tied to its agential status. So if you want to spell out the responsibilities, duties, and rights of a collective, if it has any, then you will have to do so in terms of what kind of agent it is. So what it ought to be and what it ought to do depends on what it's able to do, or what it is structured and designed to be able to do. So how agential properties are realized in a collective it will influence how it responds to normative reasons. So how exactly it processes information, whether or not this will be responsive to, let's say, the attitudes of individual members, will determine how it responds to those normative reasons. So if there's no, let's say, internal discourse internal to the collective about whether or not to do something risky, to do something harmful, or omit something good, whether or not this kind of discourse is responsive to individual members' attitudes will determine whether or not it has its own perspective. So the overarching issue here is whether you can be a reductionist or a non-reductionist about the agential profile on the one hand, and a reductionist or a non-reductionist about the normative profile on the other hand, and which combinations are actually coherent. So obviously, each of the thoroughgoing reductionist or non-reductionist analysis have currency, and this is my first point towards a conclusion. I think we have best reason to be pluralist here. And what does that mean? I think if a general theory of collective agency will have that concomitant to a variety of organizing collective agents, their specific normative status will also come in a variety of forms. What I mean by that is that depending on how a collective is organized and set up, how it makes decisions, how it enacts those decisions will be informative as to whether we can take it to be a responsible agent in its own right, or whether we take it that the responsibility we ascribe to it reduces to some of its members, or the ones, the individuals it delegates to. Now, and to the final point, approaching the 15-minute mark, I want to say that I want to highlight that even in an account that makes room for the non-reductive case, so irreducible collective agency, in some cases, even if rare, we'll have to acknowledge the following. Even if we're going to say a collective can have a specific structure and normative status that's irreducible, we have to make reference to individual agents' roles in creating the collective structures and procedures, as well as in enacting its decisions. So this is a point, so in philosophical terminology, it's a point about grounding. Everything that happens ascribed to a collective is enacted by or grounded in individual members' activities, but that alone doesn't mean that these activities or any other processes are themselves reducible.